The cold seeped into Silas's knuckles, a familiar ache. He was on the roof of his cabin high in the granite peaks, trying to fix a leak before the first heavy snows arrived. His best wood auger had snapped clean last week, and now he had only patience and a worn-out knife to seat the new shingles. If the coming blizzard found this hole, his winter supplies of flour and dried meat would be ruined. A winter of damp misery, or worse, was a debt he could not afford to pay. He paused his work, stretching the stiffness from his back, and scanned the valley below. The aspens were a riot of gold against the dark green of the pines. A thin thread of smoke rose from his chimney, the only sign of human life for 50 miles. Or so he thought. His eyes caught movement near the creek bed, a flicker of dun brown that did not belong. It was a mule burdened with two heavy-looking canvas packs, standing alone and untethered. Silas lowered his knife slowly, his quiet world suddenly filled with a question as large as the mountain itself. A lone mule meant a lone rider, and no rider willingly parted with their transport in this wilderness. The leak in his roof was no longer the most pressing problem of his day. His solitude had been broken by a mystery delivered to his doorstep. A man did not survive 30 winters in these mountains by being reckless. Silas descended the ladder with a slow, deliberate rhythm, his worn boots finding their familiar holds. He took his old rifle from its pegs by the door, not out of fear but out of habit. The mountains demanded respect for the unknown. He moved through the trees with a silence born of long practice, his steps making no more sound than falling pine needles. The mule lifted its head as he approached, its long ears twitching, but it did not bolt. It looked tired, its coat matted with sweat that had dried and then been dampened again by the morning dew. Its halter rope was frayed, chewed through as if the animal had been tied to a tree and forgotten. There was no sign of a rider, no tracks save for the mule's own meandering prints along the game trail. He gentled the animal with a low murmur, his hand running along its neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath the coarse hair. It was a good animal, well-fed and strong. This was not the property of a careless traveler. Anyone listening in the dark knows some burdens are not chosen. Silas led the creature back toward his cabin, the heavy pack swaying with each step. He tied it to the corral he kept for the rare times he needed to keep a deer close before butchering. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the small stove was a comfort. He opened the canvas packs on his floor. One held flour, beans, coffee, and a slab of bacon wrapped in oilcloth. The other held a prospector's pick, a folded canvas tarp, and a few changes of worn clothing. Tucked inside a wool shirt was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, smoothed by a child's hand. Beneath that, he found an oilskin pouch. He expected to find a few coins, perhaps a letter. Instead, he pulled out a rolled map. It was a geological survey chart, but someone had made additions in charcoal, marking a series of ridges and what looked like a specific rock formation with a small, hopeful star. The flour sack offered another clue, a receipt of sorts. Its canvas was stamped in faded black ink. Thorns Mercantile, Harmony Creek. Silas had not been to Harmony Creek in nearly 5 years. The map felt heavy with questions he had not asked for. Now the silence of his valley felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The sky the next morning was the color of a dull pewter bowl, promising snow within the week. The wind had a new edge to it, a sharpness that spoke of the high country shutting its doors for the winter. Silas knew he had a choice. He could keep the supplies, turn the mule loose, and forget he had ever seen it. The mountains were good at keeping secrets. Or he could travel to Harmony Creek and ask about the map and the carved bird. His own supplies were adequate, but not abundant. The extra flour and bacon would be a welcome comfort against the deep cold. Yet the image of the small wooden toy and the careful star drawn on the map lodged in his mind. It spoke of a family, of hope. He looked at his half-repaired roof, then at the gray sky. The work could wait. Some duties were heavier than shingles and tar. He packed a small satchel with jerky and a canteen of water, banked the fire in the stove, and secured the cabin. He led the found mule out of the corral, its load now much lighter, and began the long walk down the mountain. The journey took him out of the familiar embrace of his high valley, down through thick stands of pine, and across meadows where the tall grass was bleached pale by the sun. The air grew thicker, the silence less profound. replaced by the distant call of birds he did not hear at higher elevations. By the second day, he reached the lower foothills, and the trail widened into a proper wagon road. Harmony Creek appeared in the late afternoon, nestled in a curve of the river, a collection of a dozen sturdy buildings, with a church steeple rising thin against the sky. The mercantile was the largest structure, its porch cluttered with barrels and crates. The bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful jangle that felt alien to his ears. An older man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from behind a long wooden counter. "Can I help you, friend?" the man asked, his eyes taking in Silas's buckskin clothes and weathered face. "Came down from the high country," Silas said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Found a mule. It was carrying your flour." He gestured to the brand on the empty sack he carried. The shopkeeper, Elias Thorne, pushed his spectacles up his nose and peered at the sack. His friendly expression tightened with concern. "A dun-colored mule with a white blaze on its nose?" Thorne asked. Silas nodded. Thorne sighed and leaned against the counter. "That would be Abel Cartwright's mule. He and his family, wife, and a young boy went up prospecting about 3 weeks back. Haven't seen them since." The casual statement was a quiet reversal of all Silas's assumptions. He was not looking for a lone man, but a whole family. The storekeeper's ledger shows 3 names from last winter who never came back down. Thorne ran a finger along the dusty counter, leaving a clean streak. Folks figure they got discouraged and headed for California without settling their bill. Abel was always talking about the goldfields. Silas felt a deep unease settle in his gut. The careful map and the child's toy did not seem like things people would leave behind if they were simply moving on. "They bought supplies for a long stay," Silas stated, more to himself than to Thorne. The shopkeeper nodded, pulling a large leather-bound ledger from under the counter. He flipped through the pages, the paper whispering in the quiet store. "They did. Here it is. Abel Cartwright. Flour, salt, a new axe head, 2 blankets. Paid for half of it with a good silver dollar. Promised to settle the rest when he came back down with his strike." The signature on the ledger was written in a confident, looping script. It was the writing of a man who planned on coming back. A well-dressed man who had been inspecting a display of new shovels near the front of the store turned toward them. He had a smooth face and hands that looked like they had never held a tool heavier than a pen. "You found Cartwright's mule, you say?" the man asked, his voice a little too loud for the small space. "That's right," Silas said, not liking the man's tone. "I'm Thomas Fletcher, representing the Black Pine mining interests," the man said, extending a hand that Silas did not take. "We hold the primary claims up in that region. Cartwright was prospecting on the edge of our territory, a foolish venture for a man with a family. He was a farmer, not a geologist." Fletcher's words were dismissive, painting Abel Cartwright as an amateur who had simply gotten in over his head. It was a neat and tidy explanation. But Silas thought of the star on the map, placed with such precision. That was not the mark of a man wandering aimlessly. It was the mark of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for. Thorne closed the ledger with a soft thud. Be a shame if something happened to them. The boy, Jacob, he was a bright little fellow. Anyone listening from the shadows can tell when a story doesn't fit the facts. Silas bought a new auger bit and some coffee, the coins feeling heavy and strange in his palm. He had come to town to solve a simple mystery. He was leaving with the weight of a missing family on his shoulders, and the cold feeling that their disappearance was a story with more than one version. He knew which version he was inclined to believe. The town's convenient story was a comfortable lie. Silas did not return to his cabin directly. He spent the rest of the day in Harmony Creek, listening. He sat on a bench outside the mercantile, sharpening his knife, and heard the talk of the town. The consensus was the same as Fletcher's. The Cartwrights were greenhorns, unprepared for the harshness of the mountains, who had likely fled their debts and failures in the dead of night. No one seemed overly concerned. They were outsiders, their absence a minor curiosity that was already fading from memory. But Silas noticed something else. He saw Thomas Fletcher talking to 2 rough-looking men by the stables. They were not locals. Their gear was for hard riding, not hard work, and their eyes were constantly scanning the street. Fletcher passed them a small leather pouch, and the men nodded before mounting their horses and riding north toward the mountains. The exchange was quick and quiet, but it felt wrong. It felt like a transaction that was meant to be secret. That evening, Silas made a cold camp a few miles outside of town, letting the mule graze on the sparse grass. He studied the Cartwright's map again by the light of a small fire. He recognized the terrain it depicted. It was a rugged, seldom-traveled area north of his own valley, a place of steep canyons and treacherous rockfalls. The star was marked on a small tributary of the Eagle River, a place local wisdom said was barren of any real color. Yet Abel Cartwright had marked it. He had found something there. Silas felt a quiet certainty harden within him. The Cartwrights had not run away. They had been silenced. The next morning he left the main wagon road and began the hard climb back into the high country, pushing northwest into the territory shown on the map. He traveled for 2 days, the air growing colder, the landscape more severe. This was not his familiar, gentle valley. This was a place of sharp edges and deep shadows. On the 3rd day, he found their camp. It was tucked into a small, sheltered meadow, almost invisible from the main trail. The canvas tent was still standing, but one side had collapsed under the weight of an early wet snow that had since melted. A rusted skillet sat on a cold fire ring. A hardened lump of beans still stuck to its surface. A small, worn blanket lay near the tent's entrance, half buried in pine needles. It was a place that had been left in a hurry. He searched the area with the patience of a man who knew how to read the land. He found tracks, nearly washed away by rain and time, the small prints of a child, the deeper prints of a man and a woman, and the tracks of 2 other men wearing heavy cleated boots, the kind miners or company men wore. The tracks led away from the camp, down toward the creek. There he found what he was looking for. Near the water's edge was a discarded wooden crate, its side splintered. The wood was stamped with a familiar symbol. It was a pine tree inside a black circle, the mark of the Black Pine Mining Company. The crate bears a mine mark that matches the seal he saw in Fletcher's papers in town. This was the proof he needed. Fletcher and his company were connected to this place. His men had been here. A quiet dread filled him. He had hoped to find the family safe, to learn they had merely moved to a new location. But the abandoned camp and the presence of the company men told a different story. The meadow was no longer just a campsite. It was a scene of a crime, its silence a heavy accusation. Silas followed the tracks away from the camp, his rifle now held loosely in his hand. The trail was faint, but his eyes were accustomed to seeing what others missed. A broken twig, a scuff mark on a patch of moss, a displaced stone. The tracks of the Cartwrights were hurried, stumbling. The tracks of the 2 company men were steady and deliberate, flanking them. He moved with the wind in his face, a ghost in the trees, his buckskin blending with the colors of the autumn forest. The trail led him up a steep, rocky ridge. From the top, he could see for miles. He saw the winding ribbon of the Eagle River and the dark scar of the Black Pine mining operation on a distant mountain. And closer, much closer, he saw a thin plume of smoke rising from a narrow canyon that was not marked on any map he had ever seen. It was a place one could only find if one knew where to look, or if one was taken there against their will. He approached the canyon with extreme caution, leaving the mule tied in a thicket of spruce. He circled wide, coming in from above, moving from boulder to boulder until he could peer down into the gorge. Below him was a small, crude cabin, little more than a dugout built into the side of the canyon wall. A rough corral held 3 horses. 2 men were outside, cleaning their rifles. They were the same men he had seen Fletcher with in town. And then he saw her, a woman with tired eyes in a thin, worn dress, carrying a bucket of water from the creek. A small boy trailed behind her, clutching her skirt. A man, Abel Cartwright, sat on a stump near the cabin door, his leg wrapped in a dirty bandage, a crude crutch resting beside him. They were prisoners. The scene sent a cold, clear anger through Silas. Fletcher had not just driven them off their claim. He had taken them, holding them in this remote prison to keep them quiet. A quiet voice speaks truth when shouting cannot. Silas knew a direct confrontation would be suicide. 2 men armed and alert against one. He needed a different plan. He watched until dusk, studying their routines. He noted when they ate, when they changed guard, how they treated their captives. The Cartwrights were fed, but their faces were etched with fear and despair. Abel's leg was badly injured, and he could barely move. The boy, Jacob, never strayed more than an arm's length from his mother Mary. Night fell, blanketing the canyon in a deep, starless dark. Silas moved from his perch, slipping down the canyon wall as silently as a shadow. He carried with him a length of rope and the knowledge that the company men were confident in their isolation. They believed no one knew where they were. They believed the Cartwrights had simply vanished. They were wrong. His quiet life had been interrupted for a reason. He now knew his purpose was not just to solve a mystery, but to deliver justice. Silas waited until the moon was down, when the darkness in the canyon was as thick as felt. One of the guards was asleep in the cabin. The other sat hunched by the dying embers of the fire, a bottle near his hand. The horses in the corral shifted restlessly, sensing a change in the night air. Silas moved to the back of the corral, his knife making a single clean slice through the rope that formed the gate. He gave the nearest horse a firm slap on the rump. The animal, startled, bolted through the opening, and the other two followed, their hooves thundering through the narrow canyon. The guard by the fire jumped to his feet, cursing, and grabbed his rifle. He fired a shot into the darkness after the fleeing horses, the sound echoing off the rock walls. His partner stumbled out of the cabin, disoriented and angry. "What was that?" "What's happening?" he shouted. "The horses! They're gone!" the first guard yelled back. "Something spooked them." Both men ran toward the corral, their attention completely focused on the disaster of losing their only means of transport. It was the opening Silas needed. He slipped around the cabin to the single grimy window. He saw Mary Cartwright holding her son, her eyes wide with terror. Abel was struggling to get to his feet, grabbing his crutch. Silas pressed his face close to the glass and whispered, his voice barely audible. "Cartwright, I am a friend. Be ready to move." The distraction had worked perfectly. While the two men were chasing the echoes of their horses down the canyon, Silas pried open the crude wooden bar that locked the cabin door from the outside. He eased the door open. The family stared at him, a wild man of the mountains appearing out of the night. "There is no time," Silas said, his voice low and urgent. "Can you walk?" he asked Abel. "Slowly," Abel Cartwright gritted out, his face pale with pain. "Mary, you take the boy. Stay close to me," Silas commanded. He helped Abel to his feet, taking the man's weight on his own shoulders. They slipped out of the cabin and into the deep shadows at the base of the canyon wall. The guards were still shouting in the distance, their lanterns bobbing as they searched for the horses. The escape was a quiet reversal of their fate, a desperate gamble in the dark. A man's freedom is sometimes measured in silent footsteps. They moved slowly, painfully, up the steep trail Silas had used to descend. Every step was an agony for Abel, but he did not make a sound. Mary carried Jacob, the boy's face buried in her shoulder, his small body trembling. It took them nearly an hour to climb out of the gorge. When they reached the top, Silas led them to where he had left his mule. He helped Mary and Jacob onto its back, then positioned Abel so he could ride while leaning against his wife for support. "Where are you taking us?" Mary whispered, her voice shaking. "To my home," Silas said. "You will be safe there." He took the mule's lead and started the long journey back, melting into the forest just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky. He did not look back. He did not need to. He knew the company men would not be able to follow them on foot, not in this terrain. For now, the Cartwrights were free. Their ordeal was far from over, but for the first time in weeks they had hope. The journey back to Silas's valley was slow and arduous. Abel Cartwright was weak, and the rough travel caused him immense pain. Mary was exhausted but resilient, her focus entirely on her son. Jacob remained silent, his eyes holding the haunted look of a child who had seen too much. Silas pushed them onward, stopping only for brief rests, wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and the canyon. He knew Fletcher would send more men as soon as he learned of the escape. They reached his cabin late on the second day. The sight of the small, sturdy structure, with its curl of smoke rising from the chimney where his fire still smoldered, was like a port in a storm. He settled the family inside, giving them the main room while he took his bedroll to the small loft. Mary cleaned and rebandaged Abel's leg with supplies from Silas's sparse medical kit. The wound was a bad one, a deep gash from a rock that had become infected. She worked with a quiet competence that Silas admired. That evening, as the stew he had made simmered on the stove, Abel told him their story. We found it, Abel said, his voice low but filled with a lingering excitement. Not gold, silver, a vein so rich it crumbles in your hand. It was on our claim, the one we filed properly in Denver. The land deed carries an old stamp, clear as day. He explained that they had been prospecting for weeks, following the old map that his grandfather, a trapper, had made years ago. When they made the strike, they knew their lives were about to change. We were packing to go to town and file the mineral rights when Fletcher's men showed up, Mary continued, her voice trembling. They said we were trespassing on Black Pine land. We showed them our deed, our survey markers. They just laughed. The men had destroyed their camp and forced them to the hidden canyon. They wanted the location of the silver vein. Abel had refused to tell them, even when they injured his leg to try and make him talk. They were going to wait until winter set in, Abel said, his eyes dark. Leave us there. Let the snow cover their tracks. By spring, we would just be 3 more people who vanished in the mountains. Silas listened, his anger a cold, hard knot in his chest. This was more than claim jumping. It was a calculated act of monstrous greed. He now understood the full weight of the situation. He was not just sheltering a family. He was harboring the only witnesses who could bring Fletcher down. The small cabin, once his sanctuary of solitude, had become a fortress. He was no longer just a mountain man. He was a guardian. The safety of this family now rested entirely on his shoulders. The next few days were quiet. A fragile peace settled over the small cabin. Jacob slowly began to emerge from his shell of silence. He followed Silas around, watching him chop wood and check his snares. One afternoon, Silas sat down and, using his knife, carved a small, detailed wolf from a piece of pine, a companion for the bird the boy had lost. He gave it to Jacob, who took it without a word but held it tight in his hand for the rest of the day. Mary brought a sense of order to the cabin that it had not known in 30 years. She cooked and mended, her quiet presence a gentle counterpoint to the wildness outside. Abel's leg began to heal, the infection receding thanks to a poultice of herbs Silas gathered from the forest. A ledger of kindness is kept in small unspoken acts. One evening, as a light snow began to fall outside, dusting the world in white, Silas knew they had to make a plan. Fletcher would not give up. He would be searching. He thinks we're dead or long gone, Abel said. He won't look for us here. He will, Silas countered. He's not a man who leaves things to chance. He will find out I was the one who went to town asking about you. He will put the pieces together. We can't stay here forever. A new kind of fear entered the room. They had found a temporary haven, but it was not a permanent solution. What can we do? Mary asked, her voice barely a whisper. We can't go to the sheriff in Harmony Creek. Fletcher has him in his pocket. There's a federal marshal, Silas said. He's based in 3 Rivers, a 2-day ride from here. But he's a fair man. He won't be swayed by company money. We need to get you there, with your story and your proof. Abel looked down at his injured leg. I can't ride that far. I know, Silas said. His gaze was steady. I will go. I will take your deed, a sample of the ore you found, and I will bring the marshal back here. It was a dangerous plan. It would mean leaving the family alone and vulnerable. It would mean Silas, a man who had avoided towns and laws for most of his adult life, would have to ride into the heart of civilization and ask for help. But it was the only way. A small reversal of his life's creed, trusting the law he had long ignored. The next morning he made his preparations. He packed light, taking only what was necessary for a fast journey. Mary gave him a small bag containing a piece of the silver ore. It was astonishingly heavy for its size, gleaming with a dull white light. Abel gave him the precious land deed, its paper worn and fragile. Be careful, Silas, Mary said. Her eyes filled with a gratitude that made him uncomfortable. He was not used to such things. He just nodded, settled his hat on his head, and walked out the door. The world was white and silent, the new snow muffling all sound. He was once again a man alone, but this time his solitude felt different. It was not an escape, but a mission. He was riding not for himself, but for the family that now depended on him completely. The ride to 3 Rivers was cold and fast. Silas pushed his horse harder than he normally would, keenly aware of the time he was losing. The snow was light in the high country, but turned to a miserable, sleeting rain in the lower valleys. He rode with his collar turned up, his focus fixed on the trail ahead. He thought of the family back in his cabin, a beacon of warmth and life in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The thought spurred him on. He arrived in Three Rivers on the evening of the second day, cold, wet, and exhausted. The town was larger than Harmony Creek, with a hotel, a bank, and a sturdy brick building with a sign that read, U.S. Marshal. He found Marshal Thompson in his office, a bear of a man with a graying mustache and eyes that had seen everything. Silas laid his case out plainly, without emotion. He presented the land deed and the ore sample. He told the story of the Cartwrights, of the abandoned camp, the hidden canyon, and the men from the Black Pine Mining Company. Thompson listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Silas was finished, the marshal picked up the piece of ore, weighing it in his hand. He examined the deed, holding it up to the lamplight. "Thomas Fletcher," Thompson said, his voice a low rumble. "His name has come up before, always on the edge of the law, but never stepping over it where anyone could see." The marshal stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-swept street. For a long moment, he said nothing. Silas felt a familiar disappointment begin to form. The law was a slow, complicated thing. It might not be enough. "This is a serious accusation," Thompson finally said, turning back to face him. "You have no witnesses besides the family themselves. It's their word against a powerful company." "Their word is the truth," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. Thompson nodded slowly. "Truth sometimes needs a helping hand." He walked back to his desk and sat down. He pulled a piece of paper toward him and began to write. "I can't write out with you based on this alone. I don't have the authority to raid a private cabin without more proof, but I will ride to Harmony Creek. I will have a conversation with Mr. Fletcher. I will see the look in his eye when I ask him about the Cartwright family." This was a significant shift, a small victory. The law was not dismissing him. A quiet inquiry can sometimes uncover more than a loud raid. "And what about the family?" Silas asked. "They're still up there alone." "You did the right thing bringing this to me," the marshal said, his gaze meeting Silas's. "Now you have to do the hardest thing. Go back, keep them safe, and trust me to do my job." Silas left the marshal's office with a sense of guarded optimism. He had planted a seed. Now he had to return to his mountain and make sure the Cartwrights were still there to see it grow. He had brought the law into his world. He could only hope he had not brought more trouble with it. Silas rode back with a sense of urgency gnawing at him. The marshal's promise was something, but it was not immediate. Fletcher was smart and ruthless. As soon as he heard a marshal was asking questions, he would act quickly to eliminate any evidence and any witnesses. The thought made Silas's blood run cold. He pushed his horse through the deepening snow, his mind racing. When he was a day's ride from his cabin, he saw them, 2 riders moving quickly along the ridge above his valley. They were not hunters. They were moving with a purpose, their path leading directly toward his home. Fletcher hadn't waited. He had sent his men. Silas tethered his horse in a dense copse of trees and continued on foot, using his knowledge of the terrain to move unseen. He reached the edge of his clearing just as the 2 men were dismounting. He recognized them as the guards from the canyon. They approached the cabin cautiously, rifles ready. Silas's heart pounded in his chest. He was too far away to help. He could only watch, his own rifle feeling useless in his hands. The men kicked open the door and stormed inside. Silas braced himself for the sound of gunshots, for screams. But there was only silence. After a few minutes, the men came back out, their faces set in angry confusion. They searched the woodpile, the small shed, the corral. They found nothing. The cabin was empty. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over Silas. He didn't know how or where, but the Cartwrights were gone. They were safe. The 2 men mounted their horses and rode off, disappearing back over the ridge. Silas waited for a full hour, making sure they were truly gone, before he approached his home. The door hung open, a violation of his private space. Inside, things were knocked over, his flour sack slashed open, its contents spilled across the floor. They had been looking for something, or someone. On the rough-hewn table, a small object had been placed in the very center. It was the wooden wolf he had carved for Jacob, and beside it was a single, fresh sprig of blue spruce. It was a message. Jacob would not have left the wolf behind by accident. and the spruce was from the high ridges, far above the valley, a place of refuge. Mary and Abel had been smart. They had seen the riders coming, and they had fled, leaving him a sign he would understand. They had gone higher up the mountain to the old abandoned trapper's line cabin he had told Jacob about one afternoon. It was a tiny hidden shelter he had not used in years. It was their only chance. He had returned to an empty home, but in its emptiness was a sign of their survival. The game had changed, but it was not over yet. Silas gathered what supplies were left, packed them onto the mule he had recovered from Harmony Creek, and began the climb. The trail to the line cabin was not a trail at all, but a series of landmarks only he would know. It was a steep and dangerous ascent, especially in the fresh snow. He moved with a grim determination, the image of the small wooden wolf on his table driving him forward. He found them near dusk. The line cabin was little more than a single room dug into the mountainside, its front wall made of stone and old timber, nearly invisible against the rock face. A wisp of smoke, so thin it was almost invisible, escaped from a small hole in the roof. He called out softly before he approached so as not to frighten them. The door creaked open, and Mary's relieved face appeared. "Silas, we were so worried," she said. Inside, they were huddled around a tiny smoky fire. Abel's face was grim, but he managed a nod. Jacob ran to Silas and hugged his leg, a gesture of trust that warmed him more. The cold inside the mountain was different from the cold outside. It was a dead, ancient cold that seeped through cloth and skin to settle deep in the bone. Silas held the lantern high, its light carving a fragile bubble of reality from the immense pressing dark of the mine tunnel. The air tasted of wet stone and decay. Behind him he heard the rasp of Abel Cartwright's breathing, a sound of pure effort with each painful step. Mary followed, one hand on Abel's back to steady him, the other clutching Jacob's small shoulder. The boy was a silent shadow, his face pale in the flickering glow, his eyes wide with a fear too deep for tears. They moved like ghosts through a forgotten world. Silas knew these tunnels from a lifetime of solitary exploration, yet they felt different now. He was not merely moving through them. He was responsible for the fragile lives that followed in his wake. Every loose rock, every creaking timber, was a threat not just to him, but to them. The map in his mind, once a curiosity, was now a scripture of survival. He guided them past collapsed shafts and forks that led to nowhere, his senses tuned to the subtle shifts in the air that spoke of open caverns or dead ends ahead. He felt the weight of their trust, a burden heavier than any pack he had ever carried. It was a strange and unfamiliar sensation. For 30 years, his world had been defined by his own needs, his own survival. Now his world had shrunk to the small circle of lantern light and the three souls huddled within it. They stopped to rest in a wider chamber, where a seam of quartz glittered in the wall like trapped starlight. Mary tore a strip from her petticoat to adjust the bandage on Abel's leg. The wound was raw and angry, a dark map of their ordeal. Abel gritted his teeth, his face slick with sweat despite the chill. He looked at Silas, his eyes communicating a gratitude and a desperation that needed no words. He was a farmer, a man of the sun and the soil. This subterranean world was his nightmare. Silas handed him the canteen. The water was metallic and cold. He then broke off a piece of jerky for the boy, who took it with small, numb fingers. It was in the ensuing silence that Silas heard it. It was not a sound so much as a vibration, a distant disturbance in the profound stillness of the earth. He held up a hand, and the family froze. He lifted his head, listening not with his ears but with his entire body, the way a deer senses an approaching predator. It was a faint rhythmic crunching. It was the sound of footsteps. But they were not their own. They were coming from a different tunnel, far behind them, but moving with a grim purpose. He extinguished the lantern, plunging them into absolute blackness. The sudden loss of sight was terrifying. Jacob made a small, frightened sound that Mary quickly stifled. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct. There were at least 2 men, maybe 3. Their steps were heavy, confident. They were not wandering lost. They were hunting. Silas felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. Fletcher had not given up. He had not been fooled. The empty cabin, the tracks leading toward the high ridges, it had not been enough to throw him off. A man like Fletcher, whose greed was a compass, would have considered every possibility. The mountain man, the recluse, would know the hidden places. And a mining man would know about old mines. They had not escaped their pursuers. They had only led them into the dark. Silas put a hand on Abel's shoulder, a silent command to stay put. He drew his knife, its blade a sliver of cold steel in his palm, and crept back the way they had come, melting into a darkness that was his oldest friend. He was no longer a guide. He was a hunter once more, and his territory had been invaded. The mountain was not a place to him, it was a language, and its grammar was survival. He would use its every rule to protect the family that had unknowingly sought sanctuary in his world. The darkness of the mine was a weapon, and Silas wielded it with an expert's hand. He moved away from the family, his worn boots making no sound on the gravelly floor. He became a part of the oppressive silence, an extension of the cold stone. Ahead he saw the faint, dancing light of a lantern. It grew stronger, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed on the tunnel walls. He pressed himself into a narrow crevice, his body rigid, his breathing shallow. 3 men passed him. The first 2 were the guards from the canyon. The third man holding the lantern was Thomas Fletcher. His face was a mask of cold fury, his city clothes looking absurdly out of place in the raw guts of the mountain. "They came this way," one of the guards said, his voice a dull echo. "The tracks are plain enough." "He knows these tunnels," Fletcher said, his voice cutting through the damp air. "He thinks he can lose us in here. He is mistaken. This mountain belongs to me now. Everything in it and everyone." They continued past Silas's hiding place, their light shrinking down the corridor. Silas waited, his patience as deep as the rock around him. He gave them a full minute before he moved, circling back to the chamber where the Cartwrights were hidden in a blackness so complete it felt like a physical weight. He did not light his own lantern. He spoke in a whisper that was barely a breath. "Fletcher is here, with his men. They are behind us." He felt Mary's sharp intake of breath. He heard the quiet resolve in Abel's voice. "What do we do?" "We keep moving," Silas whispered. "There is a place ahead, an old shaft with a series of ladders that leads to an upper level. It is their only way to follow us, but the timbers are old. The rock is unstable." He did not need to explain further. Their path was no longer about escape. It was about confrontation. He led them onward, moving faster now, his hand on the rock wall to guide them in the dark. Abel's pain was a palpable thing, a silent scream in the blackness, but he did not falter. He leaned on Mary, his determination a force as strong as the mountain itself. They reached the base of the shaft. It was a vertical passage, rising into an unseen void, with a series of rotting wooden ladders bolted to the rock. It looked like a skeletal spine ascending into hell. "Go," Silas urged them. "Climb. Do not look down." He helped Abel get a foothold on the first rung. The wood groaned in protest. Mary went next, with Jacob clinging to her back like a baby possum. They began the slow, terrifying ascent. Silas stayed at the bottom, watching the path behind them. He did not have to wait long. The light of Fletcher's lantern appeared, a malevolent yellow eye in the distance. Silas waited until he could hear their voices clearly. He took a deep breath, centered himself, and then he slammed the butt of his rifle against one of the main support timbers at the base of the shaft. It was a massive, ancient piece of wood, already strained by a century of geological pressure. The wood splintered with a sound like a gunshot. A fine dust rained down from the ceiling. A deep, groaning tremor ran through the rock beneath his feet. The trap was set. He turned and began to climb, pulling himself up the ladder with a desperate strength, the sound of falling rock and shouting men echoing from the tunnel behind him. Part 1 of 2. The climb was a nightmare. The ladders swayed and creaked, threatening to tear free from their rusted iron bolts. Below, the sounds of the rock fall grew into a deafening roar as a section of the tunnel they had just left collapsed completely. Dust and grit filled the air, choking them, making the rungs slick. Silas climbed past the family, taking the lead, his lantern now lit again to guide their way. He could feel the entire shaft vibrating around them. He reached the top and scrambled onto the floor of the upper tunnel, immediately turning to help Mary and Jacob over the edge. Then together they hauled a near-unconscious Abel to safety. They lay on the ground, gasping for air, their bodies trembling from exertion and fear. The shaft below them was a pit of roiling dust and echoes. They had sealed the way. They were safe from pursuit, but their ordeal was not over. Silas knew this upper level was more dangerous. The air was thin, and sections of the floor were known to be unstable. He allowed them only a few minutes to recover before pushing them onward. They traveled for what felt like an eternity, their world reduced to the next step, the next breath. Jacob had finally succumbed to exhaustion and fallen asleep, a dead weight on his mother's back. Abel was moving on sheer will, his injured leg leaving a faint, dark trail on the dusty floor. It was Silas who saw the change first, a subtle lightening of the darkness ahead, a faint, cool draft on his cheek. It was the smell of pine needles and cold, clean air. He pushed forward, his pace quickening. The tunnel opened into a small fissure, a crack in the mountain's flank, concealed from the outside by a thick growth of ancient rhododendron. They stumbled out of the darkness and into the pale gray light of dawn. They had made it. They stood on the eastern slope of the mountain, miles from Silas's valley. The world spread out below them in a panorama of ridges and canyons, dusted with the first snow of the season. They had walked through the heart of the mountain and come out the other side. They were alive. The journey to Three Rivers was a slow, painful blur. Silas fashioned a crutch for Abel, and they half-carried him down the treacherous slope to the wagon road below. They did not meet a freight wagon. They walked, every step an agony for Abel, every mile a test of their endurance. They were a ragged spectral procession, ghosts emerging from the wilderness. When they finally reached the outskirts of the town, people stared at them, at their torn clothes, their gaunt faces, their haunted eyes. They did not stop at the hotel or the mercantile. They walked directly to the brick building with the U.S. Marshal's sign. Marshal Thompson was at his desk. He looked up as they entered, and the papers in his hand stilled. He took in the scene, his experienced eyes missing nothing. The dirt, the exhaustion, the blood on Abel's bandage, the fierce, protective way Silas stood beside them. "Cartwright," Thompson said, his voice a low rumble of astonishment. "By God, what happened to you?" The story was told not as a plea for help, but as a deposition. Abel, his voice hoarse but steady, recounted the greed, the kidnapping, the imprisonment in the canyon, and the terrifying chase through the mine. He placed the heavy, gleaming piece of silver ore on the marshal's desk, followed by the worn, folded land deed. It was not a plea. It was an accusation. "Fletcher did this," Abel finished, his voice raw. "He tried to bury us in that mountain." Marshal Thompson listened, his face hardening into granite. He looked from Abel to Mary and then to Silas, the mountain man who looked as out of place in this office as a wolf in a church. The marshal had intended to ride to Harmony Creek for a polite conversation. He now saw that the time for conversation was long past. "He sealed the tunnel," Thompson said, more a statement than a question. Silas nodded once. "The main shaft is collapsed. There is another way out, an old air vent on the north face. But it will take them time to find it, if they find it at all." Justice on the mountain was often swift and final, but the law required a different kind of conclusion. The marshal stood. "I will form a posse. We will bring him in if he is still to be brought in." He looked at Silas. "Your part in this is done. You have done more than any man could be asked." A week later, Silas was preparing to leave Three Rivers. The town was abuzz with the news. Marshal Thompson's posse had found Fletcher and his 2 men, alive but barely, near the old air vent. They were broken, starving, and half-mad from their time in the dark. Their capture was the talk of the territory, the story of the Black Pine Mining Company's corruption laid bare for all to see. The Cartwrights' claim was secure. Their future, bought at a terrible price, was theirs again. They stood with Silas near the edge of town, by a new wagon loaded with supplies, ready to head to Harmony Creek to wait out the winter with the Thorne family. "We owe you our lives, Silas," Abel said, his hand extended. His leg was healing, and the haunted look was beginning to leave his eyes. Silas took the hand. The gesture felt less awkward this time. Mary placed a warm, cloth-wrapped bundle in his saddlebag. "It is bread," she said softly, "for your journey." Jacob stood beside his mother, clutching the small wooden wolf. He looked up at Silas, his expression serious. "The mountain talked back," the boy said, a strange and profound statement. Silas looked at him, and for the first time, he felt the corners of his mouth twitch into something that resembled a smile. He nodded at the boy. It did. He mounted his horse and turned toward the high peaks without another word. He did not look back as he rode away, but he could feel their eyes on him until he disappeared into the trees. He returned to a cabin that was cold and silent. He rebuilt the fire, patched the door his pursuers had kicked in, and swept the spilled flour from the floor. He repaired his roof, the work of his hands a familiar comfort. The cabin was whole again. His sanctuary was secure. But as the first heavy snows of winter began to fall, blanketing his valley in a profound and perfect quiet, the silence felt different. It was not the peaceful embrace of solitude he had known for 3 decades. It was an echo of something missing. He had led a family through the darkness, and they had left a space in his world that he did not know how to fill. Several days later, a sound broke the stillness, the rhythmic crunch of snowshoes. Silas took his rifle from its pegs, his movements measured and calm. He opened the door and looked out into the swirling white. A figure was approaching, a dark shape against the snow. It was Abel Cartwright, a heavy pack on his back. "The pass is closed," Abel said as he reached the porch, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Mary and Jacob are safe in town, but a man gets to thinking about debts that can't be paid with money." He gestured with his head toward the deep drifts. "I figured you could use another rifle through the winter, and a second pair of hands for the woodpile." He held up a small sealed jar. "And Mary sent preserves." Silas looked at the man standing on his porch. He looked at the vast, silent, snow-covered wilderness that stretched in every direction. For 30 years, this mountain had been his fortress, its silence his shield against the world. He had thought that was all he needed. He now saw that a fortress could also be a prison, and a shield could block out warmth as well as pain. He stepped back and held the door wider. "The fire is warm," Silas said, his voice rough from disuse but clear. "Come inside." The silence of the valley was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was simply waiting. Part 2 of 2.